Hello, my name is Ray LC, speaking for the City of University of Hong Kong School of Creative Media. And this is about a paper for Zizing Song, Yating Sun, and myself about a manga that we produced in order to have positive climate change action influence. Um, so this work was supported originally at the Kyoto Design Lab, where we originated this idea. We presented at Kai last year, um, and also this is work that is also presented at present projects and floating projects, as this is where the book can be found. So climate change is a really important issue, as you know, right now. And it's really linked to anxiety and stress in our population about what the future is going to look like. Our insight in this regard is based on the big idea of a difference between the physical level of climate change versus the human level. So in the physical level, you have resource limitations, you have consumption, you have carbon emission. You're talking about different countries allowed to do different things and how much they should do this or that. And climate change deniers actually deny some of these properties, right? They don't think that this is actually what the current situation is, etc., etc. Now, what we work on is actually on the human level. We don't believe actually the important part is necessarily the physical level, although that's the manifestation of it. We think it's these other issues, for example, immediate gratification, a myopic vision about the immediate gratification, ignorance as comfort, the fact that it's better not to know, the idea that the individual action doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if I don't turn on my lights. I don't turn off my lights because I'm only one individual in these millions, right? There's also this idea of desensitization, of negativity. Oh, things are bad everywhere anyways. It doesn't really matter. Lack of concern for other lives, etc. So this is actually what we want to tackle. And we take the approach of design fiction. And so design fiction means actually producing some artifact, in this case design object, that allows us to kind of narrate this possible future and actually to take this as a sort of implicit way to influence people. Um, Creative climate communication is what we're doing. Okay, so let's show you our video of what this prototype design object looks like, and kind of what we did when we did the interview process as well.
In my opinion, if I just a user, I would buy the cheap one because I will not consider many things about environment. I just think about cheap. But so I think maybe we need government to control this company in some degree to let them push them think about their products may have effects in our environments.
Just a difference in topic, I guess. This one is kind of doing a metaphor of how cruel the society has done to those pro-environmentalists, in my opinion.
When you met the same issue, what you will do? You will choose your own benefits, or you will choose to sacrifice for this environment.
So this is what the prototype looks like. So the design object that we created is the following. So it's actually a manga book. It's got a theme, and it's got these individual stories which are designed specifically to these other human level needs that we talked about in terms of as being the cause, we think, of climate change in reality. So, for example, each story is actually designed for a particular action. So, for example, Sonia McDougall is to counter the idea of this myopia and immediate gratification. New Rivoli is a different story which takes place in the Antarctic during a shipwreck, and that talks about basically the sharing of this burden between individuals. Redemption Park is against this kind of reliance on technology. We show how the different technologies actually end up having the same place. VO it's the story about a virus and the efforts to overcome it, and it talks about how individual effort over the long haul actually allows us to make significant changes, differences. Every flash of a light is the sun of another world is also another story about individual responsibility and how we can, as dutiful citizens, actually contribute to our world. Okay, so this is what it looks like. There's actually, when we design these stories, there's actually, for example, foreshadowing, there's a turning point, etc., etc. So we designed actually based on these story structures, the basic plot structures. In this case, Sonia McDougall, for example, follows the structure of the Christopher Booker's rebirth structure. I'll tell you what that means in a bit. The particular thing that it's designing for is is to counter this idea of the prioritization of these immediate gains over future goals. And then similarly, you have a different story for example, New Rivolia, and the style that you get is actually, it's kind of, even the actual form of this manga actually takes this kind of idea of this returning in time, right? So it's also taking the Christopher Booker's plot of the voyage and its return. So we specifically designed in that way, and then we also made the magazine layout in such a way to reflect some of the ideas that we wanted to talk about, basically. So, for example, here you can see that these are the different plot structures that you see: overcoming the monster in Redemption Park, for instance; comedy in Every Flash of Light is the sun of another world, etc., etc. And actually, even the title page, you can't see very well here, but even that reflects these kind of very subtle climate action messages, right? The date that's on the cover actually is Earth Day in 2025, I believe, etc., etc. And the name of the manga actually, Drizzle, right? Rain, right? So it's kind of not supposed to invoke immediately what we mean, in terms of climate action, but to give people kind of a framing about what this is talking about. Okay, so just for information, I want to go through one of these stories to get you guys comfortable about what the idea is. So Sonia McDougall is about this entrepreneurial woman who is in charge of a shoe company, right? So the shoe company actually has two processes that it can go through. You can either basically develop market, right? So for example, just like sell their shoes as JCPenney, make them a lot cheaper, mass production, etc. Or they can basically use this funding for more research and development. And in particular, the research that's going on right now is that there's a lot more kind of variable weather happening. So you need more materials, better, smarter materials to overcome these kind of questions, right? So, so she presents a possibility to actually go into market. Now, what's really happening, though, is, of course, that there's actually kind of climate change happening in the background that we don't kind of allude to as much. We talked about more about the human motivation side of things. So she basically pushes the company to go towards selling the shoes in the mass market, right? Meanwhile, she has a kind of a personal story, right? So the personal story involves her and her boyfriend. So basically, her boyfriend really wants to get to a long-term plan, like having a baby, etc. But she doesn't kind of go for that. She's like, well, we can just talk about it some other day. Now, 1 month later, it's very quick, these things happening, but basically Athena Shoes is going not that well. And the reason is because it's kind of a hot item. It's kind of like the hush puppy type of thing. And when people see that these shoes are being sold everywhere, they're not really that interested in now anymore, right? So they don't have the research behind it and the background behind it. But she thinks it should work, but actually her manager tells you, the quality of the shoes, not great. It's a cheap shoes that's not really actually cheap, right? So Sonia, we failed. So what she realizes that actually her idea of like prioritizing this, like quickly develop into market and quickly sell them, it's not going to work, basically. It doesn't work. And she kind of looks at herself. So this is a very key moment where she kind of looks within herself. And that's actually kind of what we want our readers to do, to look in themselves to see what they can do better, basically, right? And she remembers actually her boyfriend, right? Her Jason, right? And so she realized that actually, you know what? I think this is a time for her to actually have long-term plans. So it didn't help her in her business, but maybe that's something she needs to push in personal. So you can see that basically it's an idea about future thinking, right? Don't prioritize the current immediate thing, go for the future. But you can also see that this story is not about climate change in say, but we wanted to activate those kinds of notions in people. So by the way, this was originally proposed as an exhibition because the design object we thought was about this. So basically we presented a couple of forms, one being the publication itself, and another being actually kind of posted on the wall so people can read it collaboratively. So this is the kind of thing that we propose for an exhibition at PolyU. Finally, we wanted to talk about some of the findings that we had when we actually looked at the surveys that we gave people after reading the comics, right? For each of the different stories, it's actually very interesting because they have a different effect on amount of effect on what people think about it. So the big idea here, though, is that in terms of the these kind of story purposes, right? So they're different for each story, but long-term goal, equalitarian distribution for New Rivolia, individual responsibility for this story, etc., etc. Those are really, really high in terms of what people thought, right? They thought, well, yeah, this story really talks about long-term plan really well. Now, the actual physical environmental effect, the resource limitation types of effects is comparatively lower, although not all of them are significant. So to look at the actual questions, I urge you to go to this website where you can actually see what the actual questions actually are. But for example, in the every flash of light in the sun of another world, you can see a significant effect between the kind of human level and the physical level here, right? The physical level doesn't really tell the story very well in terms of what it's talking about, but at the individual level, the story purpose level is very high. Right. So that's one of the big takeaways for that. There's also another set of takeaways. So here we also want to look at the self-report to think about what they would have on the behavior if they would, whether they would follow through with some of these things upon reading the story. So there's some limitations to this, right? So first of all, all these kind of effects are fairly high, right? So then that's reflecting possibly to our population, which are already pretty kind of in tune with climate change and climate change action. So what we want to say is that first of all, some of these effects may be unconscious, that we can't really detect them. Although in either case, the awareness of these concerns are very high. And it doesn't seem to be that much kind of big differences upon reading this comic. And it's understandable because it's a very quick, 15-20 minute manipulation. And it's not, I don't believe that this actually, doing a survey like this is actually the proper way to talk about this. It's really about the design and it's really about the analysis and what about we can do on the subconscious level. So maybe there's some psychology experiments you could do, but this is not the point of this study, really. So anyway, so we also wanted to think about looking at the people who are not climate action activists, for example, right? What effect would they have on climate denial folks? We didn't get enough population for that either. Okay, so there's some also qualitative effect that we wanted to quickly discover. So for example, there's a lot of positive effects about them understanding the story, at least, right? They understand what the story is about. And some of them, if you ask them, they would be actually to be able to tell you the physical level of that as well. But it's not the primary interest, right? Because that story really is about this human effect of these concerns. And the majority of the participants also, they kind of took this, they would take pro-climate action. But again, a survey doesn't really give you that, right? Like, would you actually do something like that when we give them, for example, a donation button or something like that? And we didn't really see that in the survey. And we really couldn't do that in the survey. And then finally, the impacts can be very limited. If we ask people about the design process itself, they find that it's this really interesting idea of being aware of the problem, etc., etc. But there's also a lot of people who don't buy this, right? They think climate change is a real thing, but your thing doesn't really go into that. Now, that's actually understandable. In fact, we want to have folks who are going like, well, this doesn't really make a difference, because actually the effect would be subtle. It's a designed kind of effect. So anyway, so that's, we would love to have a lot more discussions about this, and thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that it kind of brings up some ideas that you might have.